Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone who's joining us today. And welcome to the 2025 Shoreline Management Webinar, hosted by the William and Mary Batten School of Coastal and Marine Sciences and Virginia Institute of Marine Science, also known as VIMS. My name is Karen During, and I'm the webinar host. Gerald Phillips is assisting as co-host. We are both with the VIMS Center for Coastal Resources Management. We have hosted annual workshops like this one for the shoreline management community since 1997. We are grateful to receive funding support from NOAA and the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program. Today's attendees are from Virginia and several other coastal states around the nation. We hope you find this webinar useful for the work that you're doing wherever you are. Moving marshes is today's theme, with a focus on tidal marsh migration, science, and tools. Today's panelists have national and international recognition as experts in GIS, coastal wetlands, sea level rise, and restoration. The first two speakers are also with the VIMS Center for Coastal Resources Management. Karina Nunez is a senior research scientist and geospatial modeling manager. Karina's GIS team produces and maintains a variety of coastal resource maps. Today, she will talk about mapping marshes and shoreline conditions to collect baseline data needed for marsh migration models. Molly Mitchell is an associate professor at VIMS with research interests in sea level rise, coastal ecology, and coastal adaptation. Molly will talk about marsh migration models and GIS tools with visualizations to help make informed decisions. Aaron Riley is the Restoration and Conservation Coordinator at the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, Virginia. Aaron is a restoration practitioner, so we invited her to share her practical knowledge about how to take rising waters and marsh migration into consideration when designing coastal restoration projects, like marsh-based living shorelines. For those of you who are new to this, these are nature-based practices to reduce shoreline erosion and nutrient and sediment loads. Before we start their lectures, I want to tell you about our two respective organizations. The VIMS Center for Coastal Resources Management supports informed decision-making at all levels. Some of our work products will be highlighted today. The center's GIS group maintains a shoreline and tidal marsh inventory. SCISM is an open-source community-supported modeling system that has been applied to several seas, bays, and estuaries around the world, including the Chesapeake Bay. Community engagement programs bring in data we otherwise could not obtain to help produce better analyses, tools, and interactive maps. Our products include U.S. sea level report cards that Molly Mitchell produces for 36 localities around the nation. TideWatch is a 36-hour tidal flooding forecasting tool that's based on SCISM. ADAPT VA and the Virginia Coastal Resources Tool provide access to a variety of coastal maps, model outputs, dashboards, and more. We also administer a nationwide TRAP program for the removal, assessment, and prevention of derelict fishing gear in coastal waters. The Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, Virginia, is located here at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. This is one of 30 reserve sites around the nation. Their mission is to exhibit leadership in coastal zone management with science-based solutions to complex challenges. This is accomplished through stewardship and restoration at 4 unique reserve sites situated along the York River Estuary salinity gradient. The reserve's Environmental Data Center is a repository of observing systems and volunteer monitoring program data. Community connections are also important with training and engagement, public education, and outreach. Our two organizations are working hard to provide useful science and information for the coastal management community. Today's 2-hour program includes about 25 minutes for each of the panelists. After Karina and Molly, we will take a short break before hearing from Erin. Then all three panelists will appear together for an extended Q&A and discussion about the timely and complex subject of tidal marsh migration. Please use the Q&A feature to post questions for the panelists at any time. Each panelist will have a few minutes for clarifying questions at the end of their talk, and then we can take the additional questions at the end when all three panelists reconvene. You can use the chat for general comments or questions for us. There are automated captions enabled that you can click on and off and change the settings for. We thank you in advance for your patience and understanding if we run into any virtual Zoom issues that we have to work through. Now, if Karina is ready, I will turn it over to our first speaker, Karina Nunez. I will stop sharing my screen so that you can start.
Perfect. Thank you, Karen.
And we can see your screen.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Karina.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you again, Karen, for the introduction. As Karen mentioned, I'm a senior research scientist here at VEMS and the manager of the Geospatial Modeling Program at CCRM. I have been at them for over 20 years now, working on and coordinating projects that use GIS technology, remote sensing, and coastal modeling to support coastal management and resilience. I have led the development of geospatial and hydrodynamic models to assess the suitability of natural and nature-based solutions and to forecast the evolution of tidal marshes. Through collaborations between CCRM, other universities, and partner agencies, I have the opportunity to work on several marsh mapping and marsh modeling projects at the state, national, and international levels. But today, I'll be sharing the activities, projects, and tools we have developed at the center to support mapping of tidal marshes and shoreline conditions in Virginia. I would like to begin by emphasizing that everything that you will see today is the result of a great team of scientists at VEMS, including GIS analysts, programmers, coastal modelers, ecologists, and physical scientists who have leveraged cutting-edge technologies and work closely with stakeholders to ensure our science effectively support coastal management and decision-making. So here's the outline of what I'm going to share with you today. I'll start with a brief background on tidal marshes and why marsh migration is important. Understanding these fundamentals help us to identify the kind of data we need to collect and map in order to model how tidal marshes may evolve in the future. Next, I'll walk you through how we approach this work at CCRM. First, we will talk about shoreline and tidal marsh inventories, which provide baseline data on what exists today and where these features are located. Then how we put science into practice with a shoreline management model, a decision support tool for sustainable shoreline planning. We will then talk about how we plan for the future by mapping marsh migration corridors, which helps identify where marshes could go under future conditions. And we will bring the public into the process through community science, which help us expand the data collection and foster also stewardship. Finally, I will highlight some key takeaways from our research and mapping efforts and how these work support more informed and resilient coastal planning. So tidal marshes have the capacity to dynamically change in response to surrounding environmental conditions. These habitats have the ability to adapt to inundations associated with rising sea level by two mechanisms: vertical accretion through organic matter accumulation and mineral sedimentation, and horizontal migration to the adjacent upland. Several key factors influence whether and how marshes can migrate inland. Sea level rise is the primary driver. As sea level rise, low-lying coastal marshes become inundated, And to survive, marshes need to migrate landward to areas of suitable elevation. So the topography and elevation gradients of adjacent uplands are very important. The slope and elevation of the adjacent land adjacent to the marsh determine whether migration is physically possible. For example, gentle, low-lying slope provides suitable areas for marshes to migrate into, while steep slopes or high grounds restrict this process. Finally, presence or absence of barriers, for example, natural barriers like cliffs, and anthropogenic barriers like seawalls or roads or urban development can prevent inland migrations. The phenomenon is known as coastal squeeze, where marshes are trapped between rising water levels and fixed landward obstacles, leading to habitat loss. So we need to take into account all these elements in order to simulate how marshes are going to evolve. Marshes are crucial for buffering shorelines, sequestering carbon, and supporting biodiversity. If sea level rise outpaces vertical growth, marshes need to migrate or they will drown. So mapping marsh migration pathways is critical for long-term wetland survival. That is why we need robust data and strategic models to guide adaptation planning. Our marsh migration work is structured around these three components. First, generating high-resolution data on current marsh and shoreline conditions. Next, we use these datasets to model and map potential areas where marshes could migrate upland over time. This step helps us understand where marshes are more likely to persist or expand as sea levels rise. Finally, we translate this science into practical tools to guide conservation planning and policy decisions across Virginia's coastal regions. As I mentioned before, today I will be focusing on our work in Virginia, which is currently funded by NOAA and the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program. I'll share how we are updating and expanding the shoreline and tidal marsh inventories in Virginia, as well as the upgraded version of the shoreline management model, version 6.0 now, the one that we are currently applying in our coastal counties. I'll also show you where you can visualize and access the marsh migration data and how you can get involved through one of our community science apps. Here you can see the workflow. Our approach integrate spatial data, machine learning, and also community science to produce enhanced shoreline and tidal marsh inventories. These inventories are the base for modeling risk assessment, scenario analysis, and the development of adaptation strategies. The resulting outputs feed into a decision support tool, which was co-developed with stakeholder input to ensure that it addresses diverse end user needs and management priorities. So I'm going to provide a brief description of all these components. So let's start with the foundation, the base data. So VIM has been generating and maintaining shoreline and tidal marsh inventories in Virginia since the 70s. These inventories are geospatial datasets developed as a resource for assessing conditions along tidal shorelines. These conditions can be observed and categorized from aerial photograph interpretation, field observations, and other available spatial information. As I mentioned before, these inventories provide important baseline information to support shoreline management and improve the decision-making capacity of many stakeholder groups. They are also required to run the VIM's shoreline management models and marsh migration projections. And they also serve as a key input data for running different modules in Schism, including the tidal marsh model. This is a hydrodynamic and cross-scale model that to evaluate the evolution of tidal marshes. And Schism, this stands for semi-implicit cross-scale hydrodynamic integrated system model. As Karen mentioned before, this modeling framework is the official modeling framework adopted by the EPA Chesapeake Bay program for assessing water quality and monitoring restoration efforts in the Chesapeake Bay. Some of the shoreline conditions included in these inventories are natural shoreline features like wetlands and beaches, shoreline protection structures such as breakwaters, revetment, bulkheads, which are very important to model for sediment transport and assessing also marsh migration potential. Water access structures like docks, boathouses, boat ramps, and marinas, and bank conditions such as bank height and bank slope. You can see here on the left the main categories that were part of the previous shoreline inventories, and on the right in red are the new features that are being included in this new iteration of shoreline inventories, which started last year here for Virginia. So traditional methods for generating these inventories rely heavily on in-situ field surveys and manual delineation using aerial imagery. As you can imagine, this was a very labor-intensive and time-consuming process to cover the whole state. So to keep up with rapidly changing conditions and maintaining up-to-date information, we are now incorporating machine learning to automate the mapping of several features. For example, shoreline protection structures such as bulkhead, groins, riprap, and breakwaters. So deep learning is a field within artificial intelligence that allow computers to learn from data and enhance their performance on tasks without needing specific programming for each task. So it uses algorithms to identify patterns in data, enabling the system to make decisions when presented with new information. So we are using a deep learning framework, specifically a CNN architecture, to identify shoreline structure from remotely sensed imagery. Our UNet model is trained to detect features like revetment, bulkheads, and marsh edge in high-resolution imagery, increasing the efficiency and consistency of shoreline structure mapping. We're also using deep learning models to detect recreational and navigational structures, such as docks. Using instant segmentation, we were able to map these features with high spatial precision. This data has been used to estimate, for example, bow wake activity, which has been shown to significantly contribute to erosion in many rivers and creeks. For tidal wetlands, we use Sentinel-2 and NEP imagery along with a transfer learning approach to automate the mapping of tidal marsh boundaries. These enable us to monitor and track changes in the spatial extent and distribution of these coastal habitats. I would like also to highlight here that all the mapping, whether generated through machine learning or photo interpretation using aerial satellite imagery, follows a very rigorous QA and QC protocol, which is conducted by CCRN scientists. So shoreline and tidal marsh inventory data are publicly available through the Virginia Coastal Resource Tools on the VIMS website. The platform provides tools for both visualization and data download to support informed decision-making. So our second component of this process is the shoreline management model. Now that we have the base data, we need to put that science into practice. So the shoreline management model is a spatial explicit model that provides best management practices for tidal shoreline erosion control and identifies where nature-based solutions are suitable. It is based on decision tree logic using more than 4,000 field visits, site visits. And the new version also integrates the latest inventory information and community input. Outputs include best management practice site suitability map for conservation and resilient planning. So the shoreline management model was upgraded to improve the accuracy and relevance of shoreline stabilization recommendations in response to changing coastal conditions and local management needs to better reflect ecological priorities and stakeholders' needs. This conceptual diagram illustrates the major component of the upgraded shoreline management model version 6.0. Input to the model include a wide array of data, physical shoreline features, ecological attributes, human infrastructure, and regulatory designations. This holistic dataset approach ensures recommendations are grounded in site-specific coastal dynamics. The various input data layers are transferred to the base shoreline, which is then run through the model to generate preferred best management practices for both defended and undefended shorelines. In Virginia, this is different for the model that has been applied in other states, but here in Virginia, the model provides 24 possible recommendations across categories such as living shorelines, traditional approaches, special considerations, and no action needed. Each recommendations identify appropriate best management practice for erosion control along a specific shoreline segment. The model also highlights areas suitable for oyster structures, supporting both erosion control and habitat enhancement. So by overlapping data, for example, about marsh migration pathways onto these model outputs, we can prioritize shoreline management strategies that not only stabilize the coast, but also preserve or enable space for future marsh movement. Statistics and current model outputs in Virginia can be also visualized in the Virginia Coastal Resource Tool. End user can visualize the spatial data, download the GIS files, read definitions, and access to the technical documentation. For example, in the Coastal Viewer, user can visualize the outputs in an interactive map. Here's an example of the shoreline management model spatial outputs. On the left, you can see the line feature displaying the best management practice recommendation along the shoreline. These sections are of Gloucester County here in Virginia. We can see the different recommendations, the main categories, and the specific recommendation within each category, depending on the site-specific conditions. In these cases, some areas, for example, we can see are suitable for living shorelines. Others, where it's recommended, replace the existing structure with living shoreline. Some areas that living shoreline are not suitable, so a traditional structure is recommended. And other areas that no action is needed. On your right, you can see the output of the oyster structure branch of the model, highlighting areas where oyster structures could be used for erosion control and habitat enhancement. Special considerations or ecological conflicts are also highlighted. End user can also view the model results in a dashboard format, which displays statistics and summarizes the information by locality about the different type of recommendations. Now onto the third component of the project. So we start with the baseline data from the inventories. Based on that, we provide best management practices, recommendation for current shoreline conditions. And from there, we can shift our focus to planning for the future. So key questions are, where will tidal marshes migrate in the future? And how will upland areas will be affected by this migration? So currently, there are several marsh migration models, each with different assumptions and methods. I won't go in detail on those now, as you will be hearing more about marsh modeling shortly from Molly. But what I do want to highlight now is a new marsh migration layer that we are now serving as a part of this broader dataset collection, which was included in response to a stakeholder request. So to support long-term resilient planning, we apply a multimodal marsh migration approach to forecast where marshes are likely to move at sea level rise. So using output from well-established models in Virginia, we created the Marsh Migration Corridor Envelope, which is a raster layer that displays the level of agreement among the model output, which helps to identify areas where the highest probability of transitioning into marsh habitat under two sea level rise scenarios. This information is critical for strategic conservation and land use planning, and it allows decision makers to prioritize and protect future marsh migration zones. The marsh migration corridor layers can also be visualized and accessed through the Virginia Coastal Resource Tool. Sorry. So the final and very important part of this project is bringing the community. So as part of our project and with stakeholder input, we developed a community science mobile app called Map My Shore. With this app, we engage the community in data collection. The app empowers people to assess thems by collecting and ground-truthing shoreline inventory features, especially those related to natural and coastal resources. This collaboration helps validate remote sensing data, enhance the accuracy of our inventories, and ensure, most importantly, that local knowledge is incorporated into coastal management. This QR code will take you to the Map My Shore webpage, where you can find more information about the app and how to download it. Our Map My Shore app lets the community report shoreline conditions in near real time. So users can report features such as shoreline structures, natural buffers, recreational areas, bank conditions, and more. They begin by selecting the feature they want to survey, and to support accurate reporting, the app provides definitions and reference photos to help users identify different coastal features. For example, when surveying coastal erosion protection structures like a bulkhead here in this example, which is important because it acts as a barrier to marsh migration, the app guides all the users through the identification process. User can flag the features on the map. If they want, they can also add comments and take and submit photos. Community members can also flag areas with tidal marshes, identify plant species, and submit georeferenced photos of various marsh plant communities to support the maintenance of tidal marsh inventories. And after they submit the survey, their activity appears in this dashboard. The app's data feed into a dashboard within the Virginia Coastal Resource tool, highlighting community engagement. It displays the spatial distribution of data entries and provides statistics across localities. Each submission is quality assured and quality controlled by VEM scientists before being incorporated into the official shoreline inventory. This process helps decision makers and communities to visualize shoreline changes in near real time. Once the data is verified by VEM scientists, it is integrated into the current inventory and also updated and merged into the Map My Shore verified data layers, allowing end users to easily visualize the latest updates. So to summarize, here are some key takeaways. So our approach to mapping tidal marshes and shoreline conditions integrates geospatial data, remote sensing, AI, and community input. This combination of methods support more informed and site-specific decision-making. By using scalable and repeatable techniques, we ensure shoreline and marsh migration data remain accurate and current, which is essential for tracking changes over time. Community engagement not only improves data quality, but also promotes a deeper understanding of shoreline dynamics and encourages stewardship. Marsh migration modeling plays a crucial role in forecasting where marshes habitat shift may occur and helping us also to prioritize areas for conservation, restoration, and adaptation as sea level rise. And finally, cross-sector collaboration between scientists, planners, and the community enhances our collective capacity to support resilient and sustainable shoreline and habitat management. And with that, I'm going to say thank you, and we'll take any questions.
Thank you, Karina. We do have a question that came in when you were first talking about the shoreline and tidal marsh inventory. Do you have information on who uses this information, the shoreline management model and the tidal marsh inventory data? Who are our typical end users?
Sure. So the shoreline and tidal marsh inventory has been used a lot for scientists here at VEMS and in other local state agencies for mapping and spatial analysis. We do a lot of research here at VEMS. A lot of research is based on the shoreline and tidal marsh inventory, and the shoreline management model also is using as a information to guide decision making for end users. We have a lot of property owners, private owners that actually are verifying and checking, the recommendations in the Virginia Coastal Resource tool, but also guide information for the permit process. For example, as an example, the shoreline management model has also been applied in several states. But in the case of Maryland, for example, the output from the shoreline management model has been incorporated in the regulatory process. So it is part of the regulatory process, and we have been working with Maryland Department of the Environment and with the legal department just to incorporate all these definitions so it can be used for permit review.
Right. So we have a variety of end users at different scales. Some people are using these resources at the parcel level scale for site-specific analysis, and others are using it at a larger landscape level. So thank you, Karina. And the other general question that we received that I will answer now is, can we get copies of these presentations? And yes, we will be posting PDF versions of the presentations and the webinar recording to a dedicated website that I'll tell you more about at the end of today's webinar. So thank you very much, Karina. And now we can switch over to Molly if she's ready.
Great. So I'm Molly Mitchell. I am a research assistant professor at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. I've been working in tidal marshes for about 25 years, looking at different functions and how they change over time. But I also do a lot of sea level rise work. And as Karen mentioned, I study the status and trends in sea level rise around the United States, which is very integrated with marshes and how they move. So we're going to start by talking about what role wetland migration is expected to play in the future of marshes and climate resilience in the Chesapeake Bay region. And the short story is we expect this to be really important. Marsh migration is a really important process for how marshes are going to persist in the Chesapeake Bay region, but really around the United States. I realize not everybody on this call is from the Chesapeake Bay region. So I'm going to, give you guys some information too that's not strictly for this region. Okay, so why is marsh migration going to be so important? So as Karina mentioned, there's two things that happen as sea level rises. Marshes migrate inland, and they also accrete. And they accrete by both building organic matter in their root systems and by capturing sediment from the waterways and building up the marsh platform. So we have these two mechanisms going on. The retreat pathway is actually a pretty straightforward one. It is controlled by changing water levels and land elevation, basically. So as an area becomes appropriate for marsh vegetation, it gets the right hydrology, the right amount of flooding, then the marsh vegetation starts to grow there. So this is a really straightforward one. And when we talk about marsh models, this is a really important component of every marsh model that's looking at marsh persistence is this migration pathway. And this is the easiest one to model. Some of the models we talk about today only model this pathway, okay? And then some of them also model the sediment accretion one. That one is a much more complicated pathway. So, oh, and I should say, of course, the migration onto the land is modified by human activities and decisions. So in this picture, we can see there's a bulkhead on one side of the pier, but not on the other. And you can see that the marsh where there's no bulkhead has migrated far inland. But on the side where there is a bulkhead, the marsh has actually just gotten very small and become a fringe. Okay, but the complication, so that's the complication in the retreat pathway. The complication in the accretion pathway is that it's controlled by a lot of different things. So it's controlled by the rate of plant productivity. So as plants become more productive or less productive, they produce more or less root mass. Sediment availability in the water and sediment respiration. So how much of that organic matter, so inorganic matter that comes into the marsh is preserved, but how much of the organic matter that comes into the marsh is preserved and how much is respired. And then these three things are controlled by water levels to some extent, but also by changes in carbon dioxide and changes in temperature. So there's a lot of complication going on here, which makes it hard to model. So most marsh models, when they are modeling sediment accretion, they're really just modeling sediment availability. Sometimes you get a little more complication like sediment availability and plant production. But this is a difficult thing to parameterize, so you need a lot of information. You need the species, how the plants respond varies by species. Water levels, you need to like estimate how all the carbon dioxide temperature and water levels are going to change in harmony. So this is the much more complicated piece. And so sometimes you see it done really well for a small area, but it's almost impossible to parameterize on a big scale. Okay, and in the Chesapeake Bay region, marsh accretion is particularly becoming a potentially less important factor. And this is the reason. Okay, so we have sediment coming in from the watershed. We have sediment that comes in from adjacent lands by a runoff or from tidal waters. You can have marsh front edge erosion, and that can be brought back onto the marsh surface. So we have all these different places in sediment supply, but right now in the Chesapeake Bay, all of our management goals are to restrict the amount of sediment in the water. So what does that mean for a marsh? Well, if we say, here we are at 2020, and this is a little bit hypothetical, so don't get tied up on the numbers, but we're to say, okay, we've got about 5 millimeters of sea level rise, then we need a certain amount of sediment in order to maintain the marsh platform in its current position. And when we move forward in time, sea level rise is accelerating. So we say, oh, well, in 2050, 2060, we need more sediment to maintain the marsh in the marsh platform. However, since we are currently trying to restrict sediment, what it means is that many of our marshes don't have the sediment they need for the current level of sea level rise. And in the future, unless we were to actually add sediment into a local system, we are even less likely to have that. In addition to this is UVVR, unvegetated to vegetated ratio. We are seeing some degradation of marshes from the interior, so that's the red areas on this map, that may be due to ponding and vegetative dieback that allows, the marshes sediments to kind of break apart and start to erode. So we have some complications that are stressing our marshes right now. And so all this leads to this point that marsh migration is really where we are focusing a lot of our attention in terms of maintaining marshes and their services, their ecosystem services. So this is just a little study that was done in the York River. This is the York River in Virginia. We looked at the change in marsh area in each of these subwatersheds over a 30-year time period. And what we can see is really variable. So where you see the green is areas where marshes have expanded, and where you see the red is areas where marshes have declined. And so what we can see is it's not one story. It's not that marshes expand everywhere or marshes decline everywhere. There's definitely the potential for marshes to do both. So understanding this distribution is really important. So historically, what happened is that there was actually a lot of sediment in this upper part of the river. And so the marshes collected a lot of sediment and grew in the upper part of the river. And in the lower part of the river down here, what we see is that there was a lot of development and a lot of bulkheads put in. So bulkheads both reduce the amount of sediment coming into the waterway, but they also prevent that marsh migration. Okay, and so that's where we see the greatest loss. So this was with a 15 to 20 centimeter rise in sea level. We start to see these changes and shifts in marsh expanse. And in the next 30 years, we're anticipating about 3 times that rate of sea level rise. So we expect to see more changes. And so the question is, what are those changes going to be? And what is that distribution going to look like along the length of a river, along the length of the Chesapeake Bay? Where do we need to be really putting our efforts for preservation and management activities? Okay, so just to tell you a little bit about the impact that this has on our ecosystem functions. One of the things we value marshes for is carbon sequestration. And so here in this map, I'm showing the yellow box is the current marsh area. So the dotted the blue areas are the low marsh intertidal, the light blue, and then the dotted yellow ones are the high marsh areas. And this marsh area has been there for about 100 years, at least 100 years, probably more than that. So we have, a lot of carbon sequestered in there. So if we look over time at the marsh migration, we can see that the intertidal area starts to move in, and so the marsh first expands. That's the first thing we see. The low marsh and then the high marsh will expand beyond the box, the yellow box. But then over time, the dark blue is actually areas that are drowned, okay, and the light blue is the areas where the marshes persist. So what we see in 2100 is that we have a much smaller marsh area, and this red would be our low marsh, and this orange would be our high marsh, basically, in 2100. And the low marsh has only about 40 years of carbon sequestration, and the high marsh has only about 20 years of carbon sequestration. So we're looking at, a potential change in the depth of carbon. So in this case, this marsh gets smaller, so we get a change in the footprint of area that's storing carbon, but also in the depth of carbon that's stored there. Other things that can change is habitat provision. So this is some preliminary results from a study looking at bird use, marsh bird use of new marsh, okay? And so new marsh was associated with lower abundances of certain species of salt marsh and marsh obligate species, but higher abundance of facultative marsh breeding species. So again, the birds are using it, but they're using it slightly differently. In general, how marsh ecosystem services scale is we have things like carbon sequestration, so that's how big your marsh is, but then things like groundwater filtration, tidal filtration, erosion protection, mussel habitat, fish and crab usage, and flood protection all don't require big marshes. So a 20-foot marsh is actually very effective for these ecosystem services, but the length of the marsh along the shoreline is really important. So to preserve these functions, what we want to do is preserve as much area with marsh in front of it as possible. Okay, so one of the tools we have to look at this in Virginia is the Adapt Virginia site has a potential marsh layer. So this is just elevation based, okay? So it's not looking at accretion potential. But you can go through time and you can see how the marshes migrate inland and sort of what areas we anticipate would be marsh in the future. And this isn't a very low-lying area. This is in the Gloucester Point area. And so it's a very low-lying area with a lot of potential for marsh migration. If we were to go up to a new area, so this is in the upper part of the river. This was an area which in the historic times, actually the marshes accreted here because there was so much sediment. But there's very little potential for marsh migration. So when we look through time, we can see that the marshes start to degrade and there's not a lot of room for them to migrate to. On a big scale, what this looks like in Virginia, so this is the same thing, a marsh migration model based just on elevation, on the marsh migration part, not the accretion part, is the pink areas are where we expect marsh to be in 2100, and the green areas are where the current marsh is. And so we see in some areas we get expansion of marshes, and in other areas we get degradation, marsh or reduction in marsh area. And this is both going to affect maybe the overall amount of marsh we have, but it's also going to affect those habitat services. So, if fish only use this area, they're not going to do as well, whereas fish who use this area are going to have more habitat available. Okay, so what do we know? What do we not know about this? So we know that marshes do migrate in response to sea level rise. We don't really know about the persistence of the current marshes, and that has a lot to do with our difficulty of forecasting the ability of marshes to accrete sediment and maintain that sediment. We know marshes will expand in some areas and contract in others, and we actually can predict that relatively well, except that it's hard to bring that human decision-making part in. So what we do on the shoreline, where we put our bulkheads, where we put our roads, all that kind of thing will then affect that ability of marshes to expand. And we know that accelerating sea level rise, so sea level rise is coming up, but each year it's coming up a little bit faster than it did the year before. So that means that future changes are going to occur more rapidly than they have in the past. We don't really know the timeline exactly on which these changes will occur, right? There is a lot of uncertainty still in how fast sea level is coming up. Okay, so based on all that, what tools and timeframes are most appropriate to identify wetland migration corridors and to bring these models into the management space? Okay, so Karina mentioned briefly, this was a study we did comparing marsh migration models. And I want to mention there are really, I think at my last count, I found about 10 marsh migration models that exist. We looked at 6 of them because they were available for the Chesapeake Bay. They're all available to some extent, and in some places around the US, they're not all necessarily broadly available. In the Chesapeake Bay region, so all of these models here are available in Virginia. In the Chesapeake Bay region, the SLAM and INVEST and NOAA models are available. So, what models are available and the resolution at which they are modeled varies depending on where you are in the US. But more importantly, we wanted to look at kind of the differences between these models and how that helps inform management and what are the things we want to take away from that we need to be cautious about in the management world. So these 6 models are, they're all good models. They're slightly different. So this top one includes accretion in a very rigorous kind of way. The INVEST and the NOAA models include it in a sort of less rigorous way, a more gestalt kind of way. The Tidal Marsh model considers it in a dynamic way, but it's only been done for some small places, so it's not as widely available. And then the ETM is a migration-only model. And you can see they're all done at different resolutions and with slightly different data sources. So this isn't like super important for you to understand the differences between all this, but if you have questions about it at some point, feel free to email me. I'm happy to fill in more details. For our comparison, we selected 2 water levels because all these models were run with different sea level rise scenarios. So we wanted to be able to be consistent. So we said, okay, 2 feet and 4 feet, not a particular time. And so depending on the model, they might have said that this was the forecast, for 2040, or they might have said it was the forecast for 2050. Okay, but it's the 2-foot water level regardless. All right, and so we took these models and we mapped out marsh migration at different water levels at 2 feet and 4 feet. And then we took, these are rasters. Okay, so wherever you see a 1 is where marsh is, and where you see a 0, there's no marsh. And we added them together. Okay, and so you get a matrix that looks like this, where you've got, okay, all 5 models agree that at 2 feet of water, there will be marsh in this point of land. Whereas here, none of the models think there will be marsh there. Okay, so you get a strength of evidence idea that, there are areas where the models agree, and then areas maybe we're less certain. And I want to show you how the results differed. Okay, so this yellow one that I'm showing here is the results of the ETM. It does not include accretion, but it is modeled at a very fine resolution. So the resolution is more sort of site specific. Okay, and then this purple is the INVEST model, which is a slightly, the resolution is not quite as fine. And you can see that it matches pretty well with the ETM in this area, but it does, mostly because of the pixel size, it, shows a little broader area of marsh migration. And then this is the NOAA model. In general, again, it's pretty similar. You can't see it where it's underlined the yellow, but you can see some areas where it's showing marsh having moved much further inland than the other models do. And then this is the result of the SLAM model. The SLAM model had the biggest pixel sizes, and so that's part of what's driving the differences in where it's showing marsh. Okay, so but if we put these all together in the strength of evidence idea, we get something that looks like this. And so what we can see is that there are areas where the models strongly agree that there will be marsh when there's 2 feet of sea level rise, which again, we don't know exactly when that's going to happen. But we could say that, you know, this piece of land right here is an area where protecting the land and allowing marshes to migrate will probably result in a decent amount of marsh in the future. Whereas this area over here, we only have one model suggesting that the marsh will be here at 2 feet of sea level rise. So we're less certain that that is a area that is, you know, definitively going to result in marsh migration at the 2-foot rise. Or actually at the 4-foot rise, we see the same kind of thing. So what we can say here is there are differences between the models, but these kind of big patterns of how the marshes are being distributed across the landscape can be resolved from, you know, combining the models like this is great because it gives us that sort of evidence piece. But even one model maybe can still give us ideas of where we might want to target. We just need to be a little more careful if we're using one model that, you know, it might be overestimating in a particular area. Okay, so what if you wanted to download this information and use it for yourself? Okay, so if you are in Virginia, you can go to the AdaptVA website like I was just showing you, and you can look at the map there. Or you can download the information from the William and Mary ScholarWorks website. If you want to look at this for the Chesapeake Bay, you can go to the Collaborative Marsh Adaptation Project. And so this is 3 models. It is the SLAM, INVEST, and NOAA model, but it's the same idea where they've been brought together to sort of give the strength of evidence kind of approach. And if you're not from the Chesapeake Bay, you have more limited data sets, but the NOAA sea level rise marsh migration component can be downloaded from the Digital Coast. And so that's just one data point. But, you know, like I said, in terms of the patterns around the landscape, these models are not that different. It's on a parcel by parcel scale that they tend to differ. So this can be a good data source for you to look at. Okay, so to summarize, what do we know? We know we can identify areas with high potential for marsh migration. But on a parcel scale, we are less certain if we're using one model, and that's where multiple models can be useful. And we're not sure about the time frame of when things are going to happen. So we know that there are a lot of different models we can use to assess this question, and that there's not necessarily a gold standard like this model is going to give us better answers than another one. However, when we talk about models that need a lot of parameters, they are better suited to small areas where you can accurately parameterize them. The other thing to be aware of is there's very limited validation of any of these models. They have been somewhat validated, but it's hard to validate a forecast, a future forecast. So, you know, we need to take it all with a sort of, this is what we expect to happen, not this is what will happen approach. Multi-model approaches have some real strengths to them. They can provide information about where we want to manage our conservation efforts or where we might even want to target like thin layer dredge disposal, that kind of thing. I would be very careful, however, about using them to assess overall future marsh acreage. Okay. The marsh acreage varied widely between the different models, and part of that just has to do with the pixel size. And it's difficult to say which one is more accurate in that sense. And lastly, within the next 30 to 50 years, actually variability in sea level rise forecasts, and therefore variability in marsh forecasts, is actually fairly well constrained. So they're very useful for these sort of more short-term decision making. If we're talking about the next 100 years, it's really gets into a lot of variability in both sea level rise and the way we use the landscape and how we are going to change the way we use the landscape. So that makes it much harder to have concrete management strategies. We could still have visions, but it's harder to have concrete management strategies. All right, and so I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Molly. That was so much great information. One clarification question to ask you is about sort of human development. So in these areas of Virginia that you were showing, the question is asking, does this whole area of Virginia have much human development? There's more there than was apparent in Molly's maps.
Yeah.
How do the elevation models account for human infrastructure? Things like buildings or roads that are three-dimensional, are they accounted for at all?
Yeah, again, it depends on the model. So in the model I was showing you that you can download from the VIMS website, what we did was we incorporated land use into that data set. So you can remove developed land use from that data set. So that takes out roads, houses, buildings, that kind of thing. Some of the models do incorporate things like bulkheads. The thing about a bulkhead is if we allow the water to overtop the bulkhead, the marshes will reestablish behind it. So it's more of a temporary decrease in the marsh area. So that's a little hard to do on a broad scale kind of thing. But again, if you wanted to do a very site specific, one of the high resolution models, particularly the ones that bring in like hydrodynamics and that kind of thing, those can assess that barrier issue. Some of the models don't really look at the human development piece, but you can always, if you want to bring that into it, you can always bring in a land use layer and again, just take out anything that is in a developed area.
And we can possibly talk about this a little bit more during our joint panel discussion at the end here, because I think that there might be some more interest in this particular topic. But to keep us moving on time for now, what we would like to do, if Molly, if you could stop sharing your screen, we are just going to take a short break so that everybody can have a little bit of a brain break, and we will reconvene at 11:05. Okay, I hope everybody enjoyed a little bit of a stretch break and a brain break. And now we will turn it over to Erin Riley, who is going to talk to us about rising waters and living shoreline design. So Erin, if you're ready, take it away.
All right, thanks, Karen. Hi, my name is Erin Riley, and I'm the Conservation and Restoration Coordinator here at the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Virginia. Excuse me. And I've been working in the restoration field across the Mid-Atlantic for quite a while now. And so Karen had asked me to talk today about how the changes in water levels impact how we've started to work on our living shoreline designs. So to start with, we've all kind of seen these different ways of sharing water levels, whether they're predictions, whether they're helping us to figure out when is good times to fish, whether it's just a time. But all of this information is collected from tons of sensors that NOAA has out, that they have had out for a long period of time. And what they do with these water levels is they convert the water levels into datums. And the datums are base elevations that are used as a reference for which we determine different heights or depths. And this can be something as simple as I'm going to measure everything from the height of the floor, even though I might be on the third story of a building. It doesn't matter. As long as I measure everything in relation to that floor height, I have an even playing field. That's my reference that I can then go out from. Tidal datums are a special kind of datum where they are defined by the tides themselves. And as we know, because tides are different across the world as well as across time, these tidal datums actually change. So the ones that you'll hear most often are mean high water and mean low water. But there are other ones such as mean sea level, low tide range, mean low water, things like that. And the reason we have all of these different names is because they have different purposes. So if I'm a ship and I'm trying to sail into a port and figure out if I have enough water below me to be able to sail into that port, it's useful for me to know at the lowest tides how deep that water is. If I'm, however, a developer and I'm building on land, I might want to know how close to the shore can I get before I start getting impacted daily with high tides. So that's kind of why we have so many different tidal datums that we use when we're talking about water levels. So just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page, NOAA defines the mean high water as the average of all high tides and mean low water as the average of all low tides. In Virginia and many other places on the East Coast, we have semi-diurnal tides, which means that we also have a mean low water and a mean high water as well. And so when you're looking at tidal datums, NOAA measures them in what's called an epoch. And so if you look at this chart, the size in orange, that's our current tidal epoch. But the data for this tidal epoch was collected between 1980 and 2001. They do these long periods of time for data collection to make sure that we're not just getting, a really high year or a really low year. It looks at a long period of time and it goes through all of the different moon cycles. And so these tidal epochs are based off of long periods of time. But 2001 was a long time ago. And so NOAA is currently working on updating their tidal datums. But the last I heard, they were going to be coming out in 2027. When you look at kind of the current time period, so these boxes in green are calculated tidal datums from data from 2013 to 2023. You can see that the tidal range has changed a lot, and where our average mean high water is and our average mean low water is, or our average low water or mean low water and our average high water, mean high water, they've changed a lot as well. And so in Virginia, at kind of these three stations, we're seeing about a 12 to 15 centimeter or 4.5 to 6.5 inches change in where our mean low water is. And you can see this if you look at Sewell's Point. This is one of the longest running NOAA water level stations. You can see from 1983, that current line that has our mean low water, it actually kind of looks like, that's average where the low water is. But if you compare that to 2024's data, very few of our low water levels are actually hitting that mean low water line. And what we're seeing is, again, this tidal datum has actually changed. And so what does this change in tidal datums mean for how we design living shorelines? This is talking about current conditions, right? And so plants in living shorelines are adapted to be able to live in these environments that frequently have high salinities and frequently get flooded. And so they've adapted in ways. The plant on the left is a plant called Salicornia. It's an edible plant, and they actually hold salt in their succulents. If you go out into the marsh with a marsh scientist, they may convince you to eat it. It's pretty tasty. Or on the right, you have Spartina alterniflora. It's secreting salt out through its leaves. And so these plants have adapted to be able to live in these conditions, but they've adapted to live in specific ranges of these conditions. So if you're a Spartina alterniflora plant or a salt marsh cordgrass plant, you want to be flooded, but you only want to be flooded so much of the day. You need time where your roots are not flooded by water so that they can have oxygen access. You need time to kind of recover from the flooding. If you're a salt marsh Spartina patens, you may need to be able to deal with the salt in these higher areas where the salt can get captured and concentrated. And so marshes will sort of space themselves out and create these natural community dynamics based off of their elevation and how often, consequently, they are flooded. So when you're designing your living shorelines, you need to take the current conditions for flooding into account. So I'm going to talk briefly about two projects that we're working on. The first is at our Catlett Islands component of the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. This is on the York River, and it's adjacent to Machicomico State Park. We've seen huge erosion along the edges of this south island of the reserve, and so we've been looking into ways to protect the edges of the reserve so that we can then protect the marsh behind it. So this is not, your typical living shoreline project. It's large scale. There aren't houses that we're trying to protect. We're actually just trying to protect marsh. And we have this water level gauge up in the corner that you can see that gives us real-time water level data. And when we look at that real-time water level data, what we're seeing is, again, the mean low water is actually too low for what our water levels are actually telling us is mean low water. And the same with mean high water. And we can see this in the site as well. It's not that important for you to know kind of what this is. This is as a research reserve, we do lots of monitoring of our site. This is what's called a surface elevation table. And you can see in this first photo on the left from 2014 that the Spartina alterniflora, which is low marsh, is actually outside of this plot. But by 2022, you can see that that low marsh section has actually moved into the plot. So we're seeing this in the vegetation as well as in the water levels. So when we came up with this conceptual design for this site, we don't have funding for this. This is just a conceptual design, but we tried to incorporate in those additional water level information and some additional kinds of strategies to help us to be able to protect this marsh. And so you can see here that we're moving out. This is a very high energy site. And so we have a variety of different heights of the different high energy structures that we're using. So breakwaters are the highest heights, brills are sort of a medium height, and then sills are kind of the lowest height. We've moved out from the current shoreline contour, the new shoreline contour, so that we can have that additional width of marsh to be able to protect the areas behind it. And if you look at kind of our profile of the design, what you're seeing is that rather than having our Spartina alterniflora be kind of from mean sea level up to mean high water, which is their natural habitat, what we're seeing is that we're designing this for a much higher elevation compared to the legal mean high water and mean low water marks. We see basically that the Spartina alterniflora needs to be at that mean sea level, and our mean sea level is much higher. So we've raised that elevation up. On our campus here at VIMS, we also have this failing bulkhead that is in terrible condition, and we're planning to replace this with a living shoreline. And we did a similar thing here. This is right across from the Yorktown Coast Guard NOAA station. So you can see that same plot that I showed before. But if you look at 2 feet above mean low water, which over here is kind of the lowest elevation that we're using for our Spartina alterniflora plantings, you can see that that's just above mean sea level. And so this is some of the ways that we're incorporating in these updated water levels and these current conditions. And so I want to kind of, we're lucky in that we are a research group. And so we have access to local water level and local that we can use to calculate our own datums. Not every site is going to have this. But here are a few things that you can look at to try to get your own water level data. So NOAA Tides and Currents has a number of water level stations. And so if you go to the NOAA Tides and Currents website, you can find out your current datums, but also you can download water level data and use that to calculate updated datums for your current conditions. There are a few USGS sites that aren't incorporated into NOAA Tides and Currents that you might be able to look at. NOAA has a tool called VDatum, which it's still on the current Epic, but it models out so that if your site is far away from one of the tidal stations, you may be able to use that to model your datums. And then you can also do things like if you have water level loggers accessible, you can do that for your sites to be able to calculate water levels from your current conditions. And in Virginia, we have things like VIM's VCOAST program, the Virginia Estuarine and Coastal Observing System, and TideWatch, which has out additional gauges. Not all of them have water levels. Some of them just have depths, but if you reach out to different researchers, they may be able to help you. In other places, you may have local governments or the Department of Environmental Resources or Natural Resources or whatever else your state department might be. So anywhere where you can get these water levels, and then you can use these two tools that I've put at the bottom. The first is NOAA's Tidal Datum Calculator. So you input essentially a section of water level data and it will pop out your tidal datums. Or if you're an R person and you'd rather use R to calculate it yourself, there's an R package called Vuln Toolkit, and that can help you calculate that from water levels. The other thing that you can do is you can look at kind of the water level data that I presented today, and you can say, well, I'm kind of near there. So if I look at my datums and I assume that there's, you know, a 15 or 12 centimeter increase, let me just add that to all of my datums currently, and we'll use that as an estimation. All of these different things, they're going to require different amounts of money and time and investment and knowledge. And, you know, it will ultimately also depend on how you want to do your design. So that's talking about kind of looking at current conditions, but what about designing for sea level rise and future conditions? So in Virginia, the Coastal Zone Management Program and NOAA paid for a special project through Wetlands Watch to come up with this designing living shorelines for sea level rise in Virginia manual. And the purpose of this manual is to help design and construction professionals to be able to design and install living shorelines that are able to adapt and recover from coastal hazards and sea level rise. So it's not a prescriptive thing. It's based around 26 case studies that talk about different design approaches that have been implemented in Virginia in a wide variety of site conditions. If you take a picture of the QR code here, you can access that document, or it's here at this website as well. But some of the things that they talk about in the manual are slopes that promote marsh migration. And so Molly and Karina did a really good job of teeing this one up. You want to make sure that your slopes that you're designing aren't too steep to allow the marsh to migrate. And I recognize that not all of these strategies are appropriate in all conditions, but here's a wide variety. You can also use planting zones that promote marsh migration. And so maybe rather than having a 50-50 split between Spartina alterniflora or low marsh elevation and high marsh elevation, maybe you design it so that you have, you know, a 60-40 split or a 70-30 split. That way there's more room for that low marsh to move back into the high marsh, and you won't have to come back through another time. You can also elevate the marsh. So rather than grading the slope down or just kind of using the elevation that's there. If you add sand or fill, you might be able to gain yourself a little bit more time by elevating the marsh. That's one of the strategies that we're using at the VIMS campus. We have that big bulkhead. And so because we need to get over and kind of connect the two levels, we're going to be adding sediment so that we can raise that marsh surface. Also, things like increasing the marsh width. I know this isn't available in all locations based off of kind of the legal and regulatory landscapes, but if you can make your marsh wider, that's going to give you more room for the marsh to move. Also, designing your sill heights for future storms and future predictions of the intensity of storms for your area is another strategy that was identified in the process. And then using a combination of strategies and really just kind of trying to think through these things and what might be appropriate for your site. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Erin. We did get a question asking about structure heights, so that is a good segue. Can you break down the height difference a little bit more between the breakwaters, brills, and sills at the Catlet project? And is there any relationship to what we're talking about for accommodating future water levels?
Yeah, so this again is just a conceptual design. This isn't like fully fledged or anything like that. But the breakwaters are designed for a higher storm intensity. It's there basically to protect some of the more vulnerable areas, like the forests that we have left, because those forests we want to maintain that different mosaic around the marsh, so it's not just flat low marsh the whole area. So those tend to be in the areas where we saw higher levels of erosion or there's higher kind of productivity that we're trying to save. But we also do recognize, this is a marsh, and so it needs to flood and things like that. So we wanted to incorporate in these other areas, these lower relief. So it kind of, breakwater is the highest, brill, which is kind of a weird term. It's like a hybrid between breakwater and sill. It's kind of the medium level. And then sill, again, is a lower relief structure. And both of these sites, I'm showing very high energy sites. So they both have these larger, more gray structures than some other living shorelines might have.
And just to clarify for a national audience here during today's webinar, a lot of these names and terms are semantics that are unique to a region or place. And here in Virginia, these are the terms we're using because we do allow the use of these stone structures in our living shorelines. This is not the case in all coastal states. So I just wanted to clarify that point. But thank you very much, Erin. I don't see any other clarifying questions? I have a couple questions. Sorry, I'm just reading them. Here's a good one about the high marsh, low marsh percentages that you're referring to. Some organizations are designing living shorelines with only high marsh components due to the concerns that the low marsh isn't going to persist for very long. And so it's sort of just assuming that we just start with high marsh and it will become low marsh. What are your thoughts about this? Are we overemphasizing, or do we have enough knowledge to know that that is the future trajectory? Are we losing sight of some of the other resources that are mudflat and shallow water oriented? I don't know if you can open the Q&A and see the question that's being asked here.
I can't see the Q&A, but I will do my best to answer. And this is my personal opinion. This isn't a regulatory opinion. This isn't.
And the question was, what are your thoughts about this? So that's fine.
So I think that there's a lot of trade-offs when you're designing living shorelines in a way that you have kind of all high marsh. So marshes typically are a combination of a mosaic of different elevations, different species. You find, little chunks over here of juncus, and over here you'll have alterniflora, and back there you have, distichus, and I'm just naming plants, but there's a wide variety of these microtopographies that form in a natural marsh. And the ecosystem services provided by these different levels, you're going to see trade-offs if you're only including high marsh in your designs. That being said, the average homeowner or, these projects aren't a cheap initial investment. And I think that your average homeowner isn't going to want to, come back through in 5, 10, 20 years. Again, we don't know how long these structures are kind of lasting for. It's one of those questions. And they're not going to want to come back through and, add another layer of shell bags, or add another oyster castle on top, or add additional sand to help support the elevations that you need. And so there's this trade-off in kind of my mind between what's going to last, what's ecologically functioning, and I'm not even, so I think it depends kind of on the situation, and we don't really know a ton about how long these structures last and will need to, the scale on which they will need to be kind of updated and maintained. And so that's kind of my thoughts there.
Those are excellent. We did get another question. If you have done any research or studies to examine how the structures, I believe is what they mean, would it restrict sediment delivery in the marsh platform. So for this whole sort of persistence of a living shoreline design, do we have any research to show, or studies that are looking at the effects on sedimentation and accretion to sort of address what Molly was referring to about how important that process is?
I am aware of, I think the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, the Horn Point Lab, is doing some of that research. Cindy Palinkas is the sediment person there, and I believe she's working with Lori Staver on some of that research. I'm not 100% sure. From that perspective, kind of from an anecdotal perspective, I can say that I have seen in big storms sediment deposited behind these structures after a big storm. I mean, the structures are designed to still allow the marsh to flood. And so I think it wouldn't completely stop that sediment delivery to the marsh platform, but I would defer to somebody else who has more.
Okay. And one other question, just to clarify for those of us who are, and since you work on the different 4 reserves, we're talking mostly about salt marshes. We keep talking about high marsh, low marsh, and the 2 Spartina species that are commonly used in living shorelines. But we have a lot of freshwater tidal shorelines that are lower salinity. And do you have, do these same concepts, can they still be translated over to more freshwater systems?
Yeah, in freshwater systems, you still have low marsh and high marsh. You just have a different community of species. And there have been several freshwater living shorelines installed in Virginia. There's one on the Mattaponi and reservation that was just recently installed on the York, or not on the York, on the Mattaponi River, in the York watershed system. And then I believe there's also been a few in the Appomattox, tributary to the James River. And so these concepts apply to all living shoreline plant, all different types of marsh plants and communities.
Good. That's an important point. And if the other panelists are available and still hanging in there with us, if you could come back on, and we do have some more questions that sort of are for all three of you, because they are, this is a complex subject and there's a lot of information that we've just presented. So welcome back to all of you. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the questions. I believe I saw Molly responding to one of them. Did you want to pick up what you were responding to there?
Sure. I can just summarize briefly. So this was the question about living shorelines and sediment accretion. So Carolyn Curran down in North Carolina had done some work looking at this, and what she found generally was that they do sediment accretion increases behind a not a bulkhead, sorry, a breakwater or cell structure. But of course, the magnitude of that really is very site specific. So we could say generally they do accrete sediment, and I don't think the designs that Erin's talking about would necessarily affect their ability to accrete sediment. It's more the availability of the sediment, I think, that would be the wild card. Yeah.
Right, correct. We also had some good questions that I think are sort of directed for Karina.
Yeah,
one of them
I was going through the Q&A and trying to type and some of the answers.
Oh,
so
yeah, well, we will just want to make sure everybody can see and hear the answers too.
Yeah.
So
I'm sorry.
The one question I think is the easy one to address is, and for all three of you actually, is there beach migration mapping similar to the marsh migration mapping? So this again would be for those of you who are more involved with sort of a national level. Are there other efforts to sort of look at sandy features, how they're migrating? Molly,
Yeah.
you know?
Yes. I mean, yeah, people have done beach migration models. It's a little bit difficult, and I should clarify that a marsh migration model is really modeling potential marsh area, right? And so sometimes that just means what's in the tidal frame is an area where marsh could potentially be. Sometimes the models require that there be a marsh pixel adjacent to it for it to become marsh. But really it's just mostly it's modeling what is capable of becoming marsh. So there are beach models too that do something similar where they say, okay, so this is the current beach, and we assume that as it moves backwards, it will stay beach. And I guess I just would say in the long term, neither of those assumptions is necessarily true, because beaches can convert to marsh area and marshes can convert to open areas. But so I guess just don't hang your hat too firmly on this beach model says this will be beach and this marsh model says this will be marsh, right? It's more that this will be intertidal and appropriate for one of those two habitats.
And it could very well be that there are similar efforts to sort of monitor our larger public beaches, the really large beach or ocean beach features, that there are similar efforts to sort of look at, are they moving and how do they affect the people that live near them?
Yeah, and on the Eastern
Similar
Shore,
way.
there's been a lot of work looking at the barrier islands and how they're migrating, and those do transition rapidly between marsh and beach. And so, it's a complicated ecosystem.
Yeah,
Indeed.
I would like to add that of course beaches are more dynamic habitats than the marshes in the sense of how the spatial extent is varying over time. So one thing that I would like to emphasize that for the shoreline inventory here for Virginia, we are mapping where beaches are present along the shoreline. The new iteration, we are also including dunes. This is a new information. We're mapping where dunes are located, which that was not in the previous data set. So allowing that, and also with help from the community, we are also flagging and mapping additional information. I think all this is creating a lot of very good baseline data for assessing how these marsh polygons, let's call it, change over time.
So going back to marshes and the marsh models, we had a question about the multi-model synthesis that was done that Molly described and that Karina referenced too. It is displayed. There is someplace a layer where you can review it, and I think Karina, you typed an answer to this. That the Marsh Migration multimodal layer is currently displayed in the Virginia Coastal Resources tool.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, so for Virginia, based on NOAA and the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program funding, we are applying the methodology that Molly described for the 4 models that are established here in Virginia. So this is part of the data collection that we're providing with the shoreline inventory. And that is, we have actually incorporated in the Virginia Coastal Resource Tool due to stakeholder input. So we have already finished we're finishing at the end of September, the first 10 localities for Virginia. So all that information is going to be displayed. Like last year, they are already in the Virginia Coastal Resource Tool. I already showed in one of the slides a screenshot of the interactive map. So you can visualize actually the layer, but also from there you can download it. The other thing that Molly also showed is for the Chesapeake Bay. If you want the other one, you can access through the other viewer.
And we can help find the different data layers if anybody needs additional help, sort of looking or finding where these different data layers are in our tools.
Yes, and I'll try to put in all my slides either the link, so you will have in the PDF the hyperlink or the QR code to access, but more than happy then to follow up if you have more questions.
Great. So there's another question about, I think what they mean is, do we have enough data that's sufficient to tell us which marsh is best for marsh migration and which for preservation in place? Like, do we have enough information, Molly, that we can sort of targeting what are we going to do here? Do we try to keep it where it is, or do we try to let it move where it wants to go?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I've been asked this a couple of times recently. The answer is yes. With the current data, we could build a model that tells you generally where you want to, preserve marshes, where marshes you need to conserve things for migration. Always more data gives us a better picture of what's happening. So I'd say we don't have what would be the perfect data set, in my opinion, to do this yet. But we certainly have data that we could do a model that generally does that. Yeah.
And now we have a really good question for Erin, because I wrote down this question myself in case nobody else asked it. So we have this conundrum of trying to address future conditions and put some life expectancy on our living shoreline projects by sort of setting up everything a little bit higher, but we run into regulatory boundaries and we run into regulatory jurisdictions that you cannot convert a wetland area into an upland area as part of a living shoreline design. So this sort of speaks to a balancing act during the design versus maintenance or management approach. So I was curious if you had any thoughts about this question.
Let me preface my answer with I am not a regulator. So I can't necessarily speak to that, but I would say that with the NOAA tidal datum updates that are coming, that mean high water line is going to officially move. And so what I think potentially, if you wanted to, argue your case, if you had things like water level data that you could say, look, yes, it may be within, 1.5 times the mean high water and their official 1980 to 2001 epic. But if you look at current conditions, mean high water is much higher. And so we're not technically converting this over. So there's that potential to be able to kind of argue your case. And that's where having that local data is really helpful in being able to show the kinds of plots and things that I showed. I think also it's going to be an interesting time to see what happens when the official NOAA datums get updated. But I'll also say that in the code, there's no time frame associated with mean high water. It just says mean high water. It doesn't say mean high water at the current epoch. It doesn't say mean high water at, this time period. So there's, I think, also a case there. Molly and I are working with the Virginia Center for Coastal Resiliency, I think is the name. It's the William and Mary Law School, on looking at the implications of some of the updates of these tidal datum updates, some of the policy implications of the tidal datum updates. And that's one of the things that we're looking at. So again, not a regulator, but I think that there are ways that you could potentially argue your case if it's appropriate for your design.
So can I just add to that
Yeah,
really
I
quickly?
was going to ask you
Yeah.
to. Go ahead.
That was a great response, Erin. And the only thing I wanted to add to it was to keep in mind two things. One is that tidal datums are always retrospective. So they're always talking about the previous 19 years worth of data, which means they are somewhat outdated the day they're published, okay? And so that's important to keep in mind as sea level is accelerating so quickly, right? But the other important thing is then you can, as Erin was saying, this is not tied to a tidal datum particularly. So it's possible to go out and measure sea level in a particular area yourself over a different time period or take a different time period and say this is mean high water. You do want to be careful though. The reason we use 19-year periods is because water levels very predictably over those 19 years. And if you were to do it, water levels have been running really high the past 3 years. If you were to do mean high water from the past 3 years, you would probably get a higher number than if you did it mean high water from 8 years ago for a 3-year period. So that's the only thing to consider is that you could possibly design your marsh a little bit off, but also marsh plants are forgiving and they will resort themselves if they don't like what you have done. Yeah.
Yes, those are very, very good points. Another question that comes up sometimes is about, and you mentioned it, you referenced this, Molly, about validation of these models. I know that with the schism model and some of the water levels, we use Catch the King as a community science application to help validate the water level part of the model. Is there any way we can improve the marsh migration model validation? What can we do along those lines?
Yeah, and I should clarify, the models themselves functionally have been validated for the past. Okay, so like this SLAM model has been used in a lot of places, and we know that the function of the different parameters that go into the SLAM model are validated. A forecast of where something will be in the future is actually impossible to validate. So we do hindcasting, and so this is something we've done at BEMS with marsh migration models to say, okay, if we were to put the conditions from the past in it, are they accurately predicting where the marshes are? Yes. Okay. So that's doing a good job. The difficulty is that there are a lot of things changing that are hard to bring in. So if sediment, say we're looking at sediment accretion and sediment distributions change, they decrease in one area, they increase in another area, you would have to know that and anticipate that to be able to correctly bring it into a future forecast. So, I mean, I don't see that as a problem because this is true with sea level rise, right? We have forecasts, not predictions, because we know there's uncertainty. So we just need to keep in mind that these are not like we are sure there will be a marsh right here in 2050. But it's more of a, hey, look, all the models are suggesting that somewhere between 2030 and 2050, there's probably going to be a bunch of marsh wanting to migrate into this area. And if we take it from that perspective, then I don't see it as a problem. It is more difficult to bring into a regulatory sense, though, because they are not, we actually don't know how accurate they are, I guess is the point.
And
Yeah.
I guess that's what I was sort of wondering about, and I've had questions myself, and I'll let Karina speak to this too, is we have these forecasts, these predictions of where we think marsh migration corridors are going to take place, but then we have the reality of where wetlands are actually showing up in our landscape. Is there any way to compare the two to sort of tweak or know or readdress or inform around those findings?
That's what I was saying. We've kind of done with the models. It doesn't necessarily translate into future. A model that's more accurate of how things have changed in the past does not necessarily mean it's more accurate of how things will change in the future. Yeah.
So that sort of speaks to the tidal marsh inventory importance, Karina.
Yeah, so that is what I want to just to add. Like at any, as always say, and a coastal modeler, I will always say all models are wrong. Some are useful. This is a common sense, and it's because it's true. It's impossible to recreate 100% the real world, the current conditions, and we cannot sample everything. So we have the models that allow us to get this continuum. So in the case of the forecast model, the only way to know if they're true is we will need to wait to the future and see if what we anticipated was right. That being said, how we can, and in order to be proactive and take some action, how we can try to anticipate in the best way that we can how the conditions are going to be. So as Molly was saying, one of the things that we can do, and that is a very common practice for these kind of forecast models, is to do a hindcast approach. And that is what I really want to emphasize, the need of having robust baseline data. And so we can see changes over time and we can see and just plan and see some trends. Again, we don't know, there is a lot of uncertainty in the future if that is going to replicate and the trends are going to continue. But having this kind of robust data set, for example, for both of the models here that we have developed at VEMS, static model and hydrodynamic model, the ETM and the TMM, the tidal marsh model within a schism, we have used, because we have historic tidal marsh inventories. Again, as I mentioned before, we have developed the first ones in the 70s. So we could do this kind of hindcast. We can see where the marshes, the boundary marshes were and how they are. And that is going to be our time zero for the simulation. And we simulate how they are in the present time and compare model output with that. We also can compare, because, for example, with the tidal marsh model, we also, because it's very site specific, we have this kind of high resolution and model some sediments within the marsh and accretion, so we can compare those information with the simulations and with cores, sediment core from the field. So there are different ways. The more that we can try to validate, the better we can. But again, having those data set that we can compare from the model, I think is necessary. One, just for validation, but also for data inputs.
Okay, thank you. Well, in the time that we have left, was there anything that the three panelists would like to have a final word to say? I'll start with Erin. Was there anything else you wanted to add or you didn't get a chance to inform us?
I think just the importance of considering kind of future conditions when you're planning these restoration projects, and also I think thinking about the importance of these microtopologies and the way that these sites are intended to mimic natural systems, but maybe on a more kind of regulated, not regulated in terms of regulators, but regular sense.
Right. And what about you, Molly? Is there anything else you would like to add for the good of the cause?
Sure. I guess I'd just like to leave with kind of the final thought that we know things are changing. Shorelines are dynamics. They've always been dynamic. And we have now, for all that I was saying, these are forecasts and there is a lot of stuff we don't know. We actually do have a better sense of where we're headed than we did 30 years ago. We have a lot more information that we can bring into our decision-making process. And so I think, we should embrace that and really try to bring this dynamic thinking into our decision making. This realization the shorelines are changing and they're not static.
That's a great point. And what about you, Karina?
Well, I think what is important is like we are all here because we all care about marshes, we all care about environment, we're all passionate about this topic. I think having these conversations are very important among the different stakeholders. There is a lot of information. We are all, technology is advancing. I think taking advantage of the technology that is available, the local knowledge, I think are very important to move forward and to help us just to be more open and more efficient about adapting to whatever is coming.
Well, thank you all. I just have a few closing remarks and announcements to make. I will share hopefully the right screen this time. I just wanted to give you some brief updates about upcoming events. The Living Shoreline Collaborative is a group of regional and state partners working together to scale up implementation of resilient practices along coastal Virginia shorelines with a focus on the tidal James River watershed. We also have partners and partnerships with other coastal states. The LSC helps connect shoreline property owners with cost share benefits and other resources that are provided by the participating partners. Aaron and I are involved with the monitoring team of the LSC. The annual summit, which is open to all, will be held October 9th in person at the Mariners Museum in Newport News. So for those of you in coastal Virginia, please save that date, and there will be registration information available soon at the www.jamesrivershorelines.org. I also wanted to announce about the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program, which is called VCAP. This is a program that provides financial, technical, and educational assistance to property owners installing eligible stormwater control practices, including living shorelines. The number of Virginia localities that are now covered by the VCAP program has expanded in coastal Virginia. We've had more than 70 projects already supported with a cost share value of over $1.3 million. I was told recently that the cities of Norfolk and Poquoson are coming online for the VCAP program soon. So contact your local soil and water conservation district in Virginia for more information about the availability of this program in your locality. If you haven't had it before, you might have it now or coming soon. And then finally, on a national scale, the next Living Shoreline Tech Transfer Workshop will be held October 29th and 30th in New Haven, Connecticut. This event is hosted by Restore America's Estuaries and a local partner. This time it will be Save the Sound, and this is a local watershed organization. This workshop and event is a really unique opportunity for all living shoreline professionals, practitioners, and policymakers to exchange knowledge and lessons learned. Registration, I couldn't find that it's open just yet, but it should be coming soon at this Restore America's Estuaries website. I would really like to thank today's panelists for sharing their time and expertise with us. Here is their contact information once again. I believe they're all welcome to receive additional questions that they can help you with. And thank you also to Gerald Phillips for helping behind the scenes today. On behalf of the William and Mary Batten School and VIMS, thank you for attending today's webinar. The materials and the recording will be posted to a dedicated website as soon as possible. And everyone who registered will receive an email with the link when these materials are available. We also welcome your feedback, and we're happy to answer more questions in general from the center. You can email us directly at ccrminfo@vims.edu. And I hope everybody stays cool out there. Stay engaged with your shoreline community and have a great day.